Trump aimed at China but torched his closest ally instead on April 2nd. Canada was hit with a 25% tariff, $44 billion in trade frozen overnight. Saskatchewan farms collapsed, seafood exports vanished, and in a move no one predicted, Prime Minister Mark Carney picked up the phone and called China. Not to surrender, but to flip the power, because in trying to corner Beijing, Trump may have just handed it Canada on a silver platter. And now a global realignment is already underway on April 2nd, 2025. Donald Trump detonated a 25% tariff sweep that didn't just target geopolitical foes like China. It hit Canada with full force, slamming $44 billion worth of U.S. exports into retaliatory territory within 48 hours. Prime Minister Mark Carney, fresh off a surprise election victory, reached out directly to China's premier to open emergency trade channels. Breaking decades of North American economic alignment, according to the Chinese government's readout, Carney initiated the call a stunning reversal for a country that had accused Beijing of election interference just a year earlier. As Bloomberg reported, Canada accounted for over $349.44 billion in U.S. exports in 2024, making it the single largest buyer of American goods. Yet Trump's tariffs treated it as an adversary, not an ally. Carney's response wasn't symbolic, it was systemic, by engaging Beijing directly. He didn't just pivot trade strategy, he upended Canada's post-war foreign policy identity. But what was the cost of that call, and why did Trump push his closest partner to the brink within days of the tariff announcement? China imposed 100% duties on Canadian canola exports, crippling a $29 billion industry overnight, and layered 25% tariffs on seafood and pork gutting. Another $7 billion in annual trade. Manitoba's Canola Council reported a 36% drop in overseas shipments in just 3 weeks. And pork processors in Quebec warned of mass layoffs as refrigerated stockpiles ballooned. These weren't targeted measures, they were blunt instruments aimed at Canada for following Trump's lead, as the Wall Street Journal noted, while U.S. giants like GM faced a $5 billion tariff drag in 2025. Canadian producers lacked the buffers to survive even a fraction of that impact. Trump's trade war didn't strengthen domestic industry, it triggered a synchronized collapse across supply chains that included allies. Even U.S. retailers like Busy Baby saw shipment costs spike to $230,000 per container, and the damage didn't end at the border. Canada's tourism economy, already battered, saw cross-border travel drop 18% in Q2, according to FedBeige book data. But while the numbers told one story, Carney's next move would reshape the geopolitical map, faced with multi-sector losses and no U.S. safety net. Carney didn't grandstand. He negotiated in February. Canada's federal export index dropped 12.3%, its steepest fall since CO lockdowns. Yet instead of retaliating with rhetoric, Carney opened strategic talks with China's State Council, framing the pivot as an economic triage, not a political alignment. "We're solving a multivariable equation," Carney said, pointing to a future in which China, the largest importer of agricultural goods globally, may become essential to Canada's food export recovery. China's recent trade deals with Brazil and Argentina signaled its hunger for diversified suppliers, deals worth $9.7 billion in the first quarter. Alone, according to Reuters, Carney's pitch wasn't ideological, it was mathematical. The US had slapped a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, Canada followed blindly, and Beijing responded by freezing imports from both. Europe, meanwhile, had paused, investigated, and retained access. The message was clear: those who mimic Trump's tactics bear his consequences. But could Carney reverse that math before permanent damage was done? Canada's decision to mirror Trump's 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs without independent review triggered Beijing's swift retaliation. But the real damage came from how Washington reacted afterward by doing nothing. According to Reuters, China halted Canadian canola imports just 72 hours after the announcement. And unlike with Mexico, the US offered no diplomatic or economic support to its northern neighbor. Federal trade data shows that over 76% of Canadian exports still flow to the US, yet Canada received no exemptions, no back-channel talks while the EU launched an anti-subsidy probe before responding to China. Canada jumped into alignment and got blindsided. As Bloomberg reported, Brazil and Argentina quickly moved to sign $9.7 billion in alternative agricultural supply deals with China during Canada's diplomatic vacuum, edging Ottawa out of markets. It once dominated. Mark Carney later described the moment as a collision of loyalty and logic, but in farm towns across Manitoba and Nova Scotia, it felt like betrayal by default. What started as economic cooperation ended in isolation, and Canada had to decide if the old alliance was still worth defending. The economic fallout hit fast and wide. The Canola Council of Canada reported a 42% drop in shipments to China within 4 weeks, while pork exports fell by 31%, forcing processors in Quebec to cancel expansion plans. Meanwhile, the seafood industry in British Columbia watched $380 million in export orders vanish, with cold storage now running at full capacity. But as panic spread among exporters, Carney took a quieter path, activating direct ministerial talks with Beijing rather than escalating through public pressure. According to China's Ministry of Commerce, Carney proposed conditional tariff relief tied to broader agricultural cooperation and transparent inspections, essentially resetting terms of trade rather than seeking a quick concession. While some critics saw it as capitulation, Bloomberg noted that Canada's agricultural export diversification to Southeast Asia grew 12% in the first quarter of 2025, a direct result of Carney's shift in engagement strategy. He didn't deny China's coercive tactics. He used them as a case study in leverage, the same leverage Canada now had to develop fast if it hoped to survive outside America's shadow. But as Carney made his move, another storm was brewing back in Washington. Ask yourself this. If your top customers suddenly raised prices by 25% overnight, would you keep selling to them or start calling their competitors? That's the dilemma Canadian exporters faced when Trump's April tariff blitz hit $44 billion in US-bound trade, according to the Wall Street Journal Small Business. Owners like Beth Fimbo Banachie saw shipping costs balloon to $230,000 per container, while Prosper retailers reported a 20% decline in Canadian foot traffic in northern U.S. towns. General Motors projected a $5 billion cost burden for 2025 alone. But behind these macro figures are real losses. Saskatchewan canola fields left UNH-harvested frozen pork piling up in Montreal. Warehouses lobster boats docked in Halifax with nowhere to ship. Trump's trade war didn't create American jobs. It inflated costs and punished middlemen on both sides of the border. And if Canada can't rely on its biggest trading partner, who does it trade loyalty for next? Canada's retaliatory tariffs, 25% on U.S. aluminum cars, and $22 billion worth of other imports were not just policy responses. They were warnings. Trade data from Global Affairs Canada shows a 178% drop in bilateral trade volume in the second quarter of 2025, the steepest quarterly decline since the 2008 financial crisis yet. The real rupture came politically. Trump skipped the G7 hosted in Toronto, refused bilateral negotiations, and dismissed Carney's visit to Washington as performative during a Fox Business interview. The fallout spread fast. Canadian buyers turned away from U.S. goods, favoring Italian tomatoes over Californian Quebec pepperoni, over Ohio, made maple-sweetened sparkling water. Outsold Coca-Cola for the first time in Canadian supermarkets, according to Nielsen. Data loyalty became a liability. And when Carney warned that we must never forget the lessons of betrayal, it wasn't rhetoric. It was a quiet declaration of independence under Carney. Canada is no longer following Washington's foreign policy playbook. It's drafting its own. Bloomberg reports that Carney has opened trilateral trade talks with Japan and the European Union focused on digital services and agriculture, a direct shift away from reliance on North American markets. The Canada-China agricultural talks now center around long-term inspection protocols, while Southeast Asia, led by Vietnam and Malaysia, absorbed 12% of Canada's diverted pork exports in the first quarter of 2025. In contrast, the US doubled down on protectionism, extending electric vehicle and steel tariffs. Across 18 new product categories, the divergence is sharp. Canada is aligning itself with multilateralism, while Trump pushes bilateral muscle. You can't build stable exports on unilateral tariffs, said John.